Boston-based writer Doug Most's new book is called Launching Liberty, subtitled To Build the Ships That Took America to War. Most, who spent 15 years at the Boston Globe, writes, and I quote, "In total, American shipyards produced 2,710 Liberty ships in essentially 4 years, peaking in the spring and summer of 1943, when almost 800 ships were built in 7 months. A lot of the credit is given to Henry Kaiser, who produced half of all Liberty ships, 1,490. By 1943, average time per ship was down to 42 days, the fastest month recorded. Author Doug Most is currently working at Boston University. Doug Most, can you describe a Liberty ship?
Yeah, so a Liberty ship is, imagine you're on a football field and you were to walk the length of a football field from one end to another. That's a long walk. Now you got to walk another 100 feet to really get a feel for just how big these ships were. They were 441 feet in length, so about 100 feet longer than a football field. But really what made them striking was their depth. They were about the height of a 10-story building. And that depth is what made them so valuable in the war, because they had this incredible capacity to hold an immense amount of cargo in their cargo holds. And so the depth of the ships is really what made them so important to World War II.
When was the first one built?
So the Liberty ship program was sort of born in 1940, is really when the seed for the program was begun. Started with a British ship designer who came over from England to ask for American assistance in building cargo ships. We provided that assistance and got the program off and running, but it wasn't until President Roosevelt announced that we had to build our own cargo ships in preparation for war. In early 1941 is when the program really got off the ground. And the first Liberty ship shipyards, the construction on them began in early 1941, and the first Liberty ship was under construction by the spring of 1941. So before Pearl Harbor, which I think is something a lot of people don't realize, that we were sort of really amping up and ramping up our war efforts before we were actually involved in the war.
There are a lot of numbers in your book that kind of blow you away when you read them, but one of those, especially in today's world of television, that was interesting, is that you say that on February the 23rd, 1942, FDR did a fireside chat that 61 million people listened to.
Yeah, so, President Roosevelt was really, a marvel and ahead of his time when it came to sort of thinking about technology. And, he learned, and you think about how we now listen to podcasts today and use technology today. He really was sort of ahead of his time in using those fireside chats to reach as big an audience as possible. Those, if you want to think of it, those were really America's first podcasts. They were something that people could sit down and listen to. And they didn't have to give up what they were doing in order to listen to them, although obviously they weren't portable, but they certainly were something you could sit in your living room while doing other things. And that was what people did. And that fireside chat, was a notable moment sort of in World War II history, because he needed to engage Americans in what was happening. He needed to get them to understand the war and how it was playing out, and to really get them as invested in the war as he was.
Why did he want the public to have a map in front of them when they listened to him?
So I think what was going on, the war was very complicated, right? It was being fought across 2 oceans, and it involved shipping lanes, and it involved cargo ships and military ships and multiple countries and multiple, African coasts and European coasts and Asian coasts. And it was complicated. And I think he was worried that Americans didn't grasp just how complicated it was. And he felt like, here was a guy who he had a map room and a war room set up at the White House, right, where he would stand in front of these maps and look at things. But he felt like he needed Americans to almost have their own map room and their own war room in a way in order to understand it. So he did, before this famous fireside chat, he told his staff to put the word out to Americans that he would like for them to have a map in front of them while he talked to them. And there was this crazy run on maps across the country. Map stores were selling out of their maps of the United States and of the world. And it became known as the map speech, where he laid out sort of the shipping lanes and the countries that were involved in the war and America's interests in the war. And it really was his way of using, obviously video technology wasn't really available at the time. And so he had to think of a different way to do it. So he thought, if everyone has a map in front of them, like me, then I can talk to them in a way in which they're looking at what I'm looking at. And that was what his goal was.
When did you start the research on this book, and why? What got you interested in the subject?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think so. It was about a 5-year project in total for me. So that, from an author's perspective, that includes the preliminary research, writing of a book proposal, finding a publisher, and all that process. The actual book writing itself was about a 2.5 year process. And I think as far as why I wrote this book and what got me interested in the subject, two things. So number one, sort of, I'm drawn to stories of interesting people doing interesting things. I like writing about people and human interest. And that was sort of number one. Number two, World War II, I think we know there's endless fascination with World War II for many, many reasons. One of the great challenges for anybody who takes on the idea of writing a World War II book is that you have to respect and recognize that 10,000 people have written about World War II before you. And so when I was researching and looking into the Liberty ships, I was sort of struck by the fact that even though people maybe have heard the term, that there hadn't really been a great sort of narrative story about the Liberty ships written. There was one book I found that was published in England, but it didn't really get wide publicity and wide distribution. And so I thought that this was a gap maybe in all the World War II books that have been written, and there have been so many, that I thought I could fill. And one of the challenges when you write about World War II is, I use the term rabbit holes. You constantly discover like, oh, this is really interesting. I didn't know that. And you start to research a rabbit hole and go down the rabbit hole only to discover that like, oh, there have been 7 books written about that rabbit hole that I thought I discovered. So I really did have to stay very focused on, Liberty ships. That was my book. I wasn't writing a World War II book. I wasn't writing a 1940 to 1945 book. I was writing sort of a very narrow narrative of this one project. That kept me focused.
Who named these ships Liberty?
So that is one of the great questions that, I've never been able to answer in terms of a name of a person. Here's what I know. I was trying to understand when and where the term Liberty Fleet and Liberty ships surfaced. And there is a book that's out there that was written by a maritime historian named Frederick Lane. Came out in like 1950, and it's considered sort of the Bible of Liberty ships. It was almost like a textbook of Liberty ships. It's 1,000 pages long, and it's this immense, dense book. But it's also unbelievably valuable as a resource. And his footnotes and his notes in his book and his citations were really critical for me and for other researchers. In that book, there is a reference to a memo that came out in May of 1941 that sort of is the first reference to Liberty ships. I spent weeks trying to find that memo and get that memo. That was a rabbit hole I did go down because I really wanted to read the memo and read the letter and not just refer to his book, but I wanted the actual memo. And I eventually did track it down. And so in that memo, it came out in May of 1941. It's the first reference that exists to something called America's Liberty Fleet. That's where it was called in this White House memo that went out, a reference to building of America's Liberty Fleet. It's not a named memo. There's no person on it. It's just a memo from the White House. And so the Liberty Fleet, the individual boats from the Liberty Fleet became known as the Liberty ships. So that's sort of where the word liberty first appears, sort of in official historical documents.
You tell us that you went on the SS John R. Brown. What is it? Where is it? And why did you go there?
Yeah, it's actually the John W. Brown. So the John W. Brown is one of two remaining floating Liberty ships in the country. There are two left, and I sort of encourage people, if you're ever traveling the country and you're either in San Francisco or you're in Baltimore Harbor, it's worth a visit to a piece of history. So the Jeremiah O'Brien is the floating Liberty ship in San Francisco, and the John W. Brown is the floating Liberty ship in Baltimore. And I have this vivid memory of driving down to Baltimore and going down a gravelly road and parking my car, getting out of my car, and sort of there it is, standing next to a Liberty ship. And it was sort of this awesome moment for me because it was, I was struck. I remember, as I said at the beginning, walking the length of the ship. I wanted to get a feel for just how long it was. And then I sort of was struck by how tall it was and how deep it was. And I was able to get sort of a personalized tour of the ship. And I went up on the gangplank, and I was met there by a retired firefighter who sort of serves as the keeper of the ship, if you want to call it that. And it's been turned into a little bit of a museum at this point. It's sort of, there's a gift shop on the ground floor. But I was able to sort of spend a couple of hours on the ship, up in the deck house where the captain and the crew sort of slept and steered the ship from, and all of that, and in the kitchen and the galleys. But then I went down into the bowels of the ship, and we climbed down these metal stairs and went down into the base of the ship, and we walked into the first cargo hold. And again, these Liberty ships had 5 cargo holds, and we walked into that cargo hold. And I can still picture it to this day. This was a couple of years ago. I can still picture sort of standing in that cargo hold and looking up at the ceiling and picturing cargo being loaded into this hold. The only way I can describe how big it was is to sort of explain that a single Liberty ship could carry 440 tanks. One Liberty ship could hold 440 tanks. Or another number, one Liberty ship could hold 2,800 Jeeps. Or enough rations to feed 3 million men for one day. So now imagine a fleet of 2,700 Liberty ships, just how much cargo that could really carry for us. And when I was standing in that cargo hold, I think that's when I was sort of struck and came to this realization that in many ways, this is where the war was won. Nothing will ever take away from the troops and the soldiers who fought the war. Nothing will ever take away from that. But without the Liberty ships, bringing them the tanks and jeeps and boxed up airplanes and rations and medical supplies and everything they carried, the troops would not have been able to fight and win the war. They needed those supplies across these giant oceans. And that was the purpose of these Liberty ships. So there was sort of a moving moment for me to sort of be able to stand inside this cargo ship and really visualize that cargo hold being filled with so much cargo.
You triggered a memory for me because when you say Jeep, I'm old enough to know, and I used to see them years ago, a car called the Henry J,
yep,
and also something called the Kaiser Jeep. Henry Kaiser is very important in your book. Tell us who he was.
Yeah. So I think, Henry Kaiser is an American industrialist who I think his story sometimes gets lost among the era in which he lived because there were so many other great American inventors and industrialists, right? I mean, from Thomas Edison to Alexander Graham Bell to Henry Ford, there are so many names that immediately spring to mind when we think of some great American inventors and industrialists. Kaiser was born the same year as President Roosevelt in 1882, and they were both born in upstate New York, about 100 miles apart from each other. But they wouldn't cross paths until 50 years later into their lives. He was throughout most of his 20s and 30s, a guy who became a builder of things. He built roads, he built bridges, he built dams. He took on the building of the Boulder Dam, which became known as the Hoover Dam. And that was sort of the project in many ways that landed him on the map of sort of people to be reckoned with. When he finished the Hoover Dam, the Boulder Dam, ahead of schedule and under budget, and President Roosevelt came out for the unveiling and opening of that dam, it really was sort of an introduction for the two men in many ways. Roosevelt was so impressed with this project that was the biggest public works project America had undertaken up until that time. And here was a guy who had finished it ahead of schedule, under budget. I think what happened in that moment and over those few years in the mid 1930s was that they each realized they could benefit from a relationship with each other. Roosevelt inherited in his presidency an economy emerging from the Depression and was trying to, rebuild America's economy, jobs, and his New Deal programs and everything he was trying to do. Kaiser was a man who built things, but his entire operation depended on government contracts, right? I mean, he was a guy who needed the government in order to do his things. So the two of them, I think, recognized that, our friendship could be mutually beneficial. Roosevelt could benefit from having a guy who was really good at getting projects done and building a workforce and succeeding. And Kaiser could benefit from having the president in his pocket and getting these contracts. So when the war emerged in the late 1930s, their friendship sort of was already established. And I think that was why Kaiser became such a critical player in building the Liberty ships. He stepped up and raised his hand as a willing person to help build these ships, even though he'd never built a ship in his life.
I know this is not a very important thing in the book, but you've taught me something I didn't know, but I wanted to ask you about it. You tell us where the name Kaiser Permanente came from.
Yeah, I mean, Kaiser, when I have done book talks and talk to people, I say, when I say the name Kaiser to you, what comes to mind? And very often it's not Liberty ship that comes to mind, right? It's healthcare that comes to mind. That's what people think of when they think of the name Kaiser. So Henry Kaiser in the mid 1930s and his son Edgar, they were building the dam. And when they were building the dam, the Boulder Dam, one of the things that they recognized in that project was that every time a worker got sick or injured, they would have to leave the work site in the middle of the desert and go to a big city in order to get health care. And that would take them, a week off of the job. That was costly and time consuming and inefficient for the workforce. Workers didn't like it, leaving their job, leaving their paycheck behind for a week in order to get better. And certainly it didn't benefit the managers on the project, losing workers every time they get injured or sick. Kaiser decided, sort of innovatively, he brought on a gentleman named Sidney Garfield to partner with him on this idea of bringing healthcare to the workers, and sort of creating creating a hospital on the job site and creating a healthcare system where they would essentially donate, if you want to think of it that way, 7 cents of their paycheck into a healthcare system that would help pay for their healthcare. And they willingly and actually eagerly participated in that because they all recognized that if instead of having to leave this job site to go get healthcare, now it's here brought to me and all I do is pay 7 cents out of my paycheck, that benefited everybody. And that was really an innovative sort of revolution at the time in the healthcare world. This idea of creating on-site healthcare paid for partially by the workers. And so you think about how we all get our healthcare today, its roots go back to the beginning of where that became. And that was the roots of Kaiser Permanente healthcare.
But where did the name Permanente come from?
So there was a hospital in California that they eventually built. And Permanente was what they called it back then. It was sort of I don't know if I want to say German name, but it was a name that they settled on when they were building this hospital in California, in Richmond, California. That was the first hospital they named. They called it the Kaiser Permanente Hospital back there.
But it was a creek that ran by.
Oh, I'm sorry. Correct. There was a creek in California. I see what you're asking. Yes, there was a creek in California called the Permanente Creek. And that was essentially where they adapted the name from. Yes, they stole it from a permanent creek in California.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute.
The Germans, the
Yeah.
U-boats. What
Yeah.
was a U-boat? And can you explain the amount of damage they did both to the British and to the American ships?
Yeah, I mean, really, the U-boat, the German U-boat, the German submarine, was such an influential factor in why President Roosevelt settled on this idea of building the Liberty ships the way that we did. The strategy essentially became, we have to build ships faster than they can sink them. That was the strategy. Because the U-boats were so effective with their torpedoes. They were fast. They were stealth because they could fire a torpedo from underwater and never be shot at. They were really sort of instrumental in influencing how America responded to the war. And, a torpedo could, travel 40, 50 miles an hour underwater. And the Liberty ships only traveled 12 knots. They moved slowly. They were very vulnerable on the ocean. They traveled in convoys, so that helped protect them. Convoys of, 10, 20, sometimes 30 ships surrounding them and naval ships. But they were still vulnerable because they were just slow targets. And they were, for the most part, very, very lightly armed. And that was another factor that sort of made them vulnerable. They were not warships. They were not military ships. They were merchant marine cargo ships. And I think that the German sub and the German U-boat was really sort of a critical factor in America's strategy for how they needed to respond and be prepared for the war, because those U-boats were so effective in sinking our own ships.
I found this number that there were 2,779 Allied and neutral merchant ships sunk by U-boats during World War II. Do we have any idea how many people were killed in that? And how many of those were ever passengers on a cruise ship?
Yeah, so I mean, there were most cruise ships, for the most part, were able to travel, safely across. They were sort of the one vessel that was, for the most part, they were not attacked. But cargo ships and military ships were attacked, and there were hundreds and even thousands of men who were lost at sea in some of these attacks. I don't have an exact number, but I do know that several hundred, close to 500 Liberty ships were sunk just in the war itself. But when you factor that number in with how many were built, most of them successfully completed their missions and made multiple trips, traveling to Africa, then to Europe and to Russia, and then back to the United States, and going back and forth and back and forth. So they were able to successfully navigate the waters, but they were vulnerable, and there were attacks and there were battles. Very often, the way the Liberty ship was designed, the goal was that if a Liberty ship was hit, the hope was it could sustain a fight just long enough to get the crew off the ship into the lifeboats and to be rescued by one of the ships traveling in the convoy. So a lot of the sailors and merchant marines were able to be rescued before they sunk. They were able to get off the ship, let it go to the bottom of the Atlantic, and they were then rescued. So that helped the numbers, if you want to think of it that way, in terms of how many men were lost. But certainly plenty were lost as well.
What's the background on the relationship between the British and the Americans in the process of agreeing to build ships for the British? And how many did we build for them?
Yeah, so that's really where the Liberty ship story began. It was with, Churchill in 1940, and Great Britain is fighting for its life with Germany, and Germany is bombarding much of Great Britain and much of Europe with aerial attacks, and America's not yet involved in the war. Great Britain recognizes that it needs cargo ships. It needs more cargo ships to fight the war. But all of its shipyards were essentially at full capacity building military ships, building naval ships. And so they sent this ship designer, Robert Cyril Thompson, over to America with his shipbuilding blueprints, essentially, that he had designed. And they told him, essentially, we love your ship. We like the design of your ship. We want you to go to America, our closest ally, and see if they will build these ships for us. And again, America was not yet in the war. This was in 1940. And so Thompson goes to America with these blueprints and these designs and really goes on this 17,000 mile, 3-week barnstorming trip around the country, meeting with shipyard managers and shipyard designers and businessmen, trying to find a partner who would help him build these ships. And that's where Henry Kaiser enters into the picture. He offers to sort of step up and build ships for the British. And 2 shipyards were established, one in Richmond, California, San Francisco Bay, and the other one in Portland, Maine. And those become the first 2 shipyards that start building 30 ships each, 30 in Portland, 30 in Richmond, California, for the British. So we agreed to build 60 ships for them. Those ships were called the Ocean class ships. They were not called Liberty ships, but they were essentially, a first cousin of the Liberty ship. They were literally the same design that the Liberty ship would become. But they were called Ocean class ships. So that's where the relationship began between Great Britain and the United States in building these ships.
Who paid for those ships that we built for the British?
Great Britain paid for them. They helped get the shipyards going, and they had to buy the ships, and they had to staff the shipyards, and American workers built the ships, but Great Britain contributed monetarily to sort of get that work done. That was the agreement, that, we will help you find the land and find the shipyards to build the ships, but you have to sort of contribute monetarily in order to build the ships, since they're going to be your ships.
When you hear the fact that the biggest ship we have in the United States Navy today, the USS Gerald R. Ford, took 12 years to build,
right,
cost $17 billion, including research and development.
Yeah.
What does that sound like to you compared to what you learned about Liberty ships?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I love about the Liberty ship story. The speed with which they were built is one of them. But, one of the things that I have talked about is a decision that President Roosevelt made, is a decision that is unusual for a president to make. Back then it was unusual, but I can't imagine a president today, and I'm not getting into politics of who's president today, but I can't imagine any president today sort of being able politically to make the decision he made, which was, we're not going to build the best ship. We're not going to build the prettiest ship or the most beautiful ship or the biggest ship, or the fastest ship. That's not the ship we're going to build. Instead, I need a design that just allows me to get the most ships as fast as humanly possible. And so that required sacrifices. That meant that the ship wasn't going to be fast, and it wasn't going to be the longest ship. It wasn't going to be something he could brag about, and say, look at this marvel of technology that we built. That was not the ship. For the president of the United States to sort of make that decision and to be willing to build a ship that became nicknamed the Ugly Duckling was an enormously sort of unappreciated, I think, decision at the time by the president. Can you imagine a president today saying, we're just going to build a boat. It's going to be ugly. It's not going to be very pretty. It's not going to go very fast, but we just need a lot of them. I don't know. Would politicians stand for that? Would they be willing to allow China or another country build better ships than us politically? Would we be okay with that? I don't know. My suspicion is no. We would have to get committees and put this through multiple ringers and, red tape, and before we agreed on the design. And he sort of just snipped all that red tape and said, nope, I'm not going to wait. And he had people telling him to not build a Liberty ship. That's too slow, too dangerous. These ships are going to get sunk. They're going to be sitting ducks on the ocean. And he said, I don't care. He said, then we'll just build more of them, and we'll just keep building them. And again, back to that line, we'll build them faster than they can be sunk. So when you talk about, what you said at the beginning, the ships of today, how they're built, that was such an important decision for the president to be willing to make, to build this ugly, hulking steel warhorse of a ship, but that was functional and that served its purpose. Many of his people telling him, we want to build a fleet of ships that are going to last 30 years. And he, again, said, no, we don't have the time to wait for that. We need to just build these ships. And if they only last us 10 years, so be it, but they will get us through the war. And they did. And so that was, I think, a really historic and momentous and sort of unappreciated decision that the president made, to build the Liberty ship the way that it was built.
When a Liberty ship would leave the United States, what would be on board? You mentioned the jeeps and the tanks and all that stuff, but how many men, and there were only men in those days on those ships, would be on board, and did they ever carry troops?
So they really were not known as troop carriers. That was not their purpose, partly because the deck house was small. It could only feed and house so many people. That was not the purpose of the ship. So they were not really known as troop carrying ships. They had a crew typically of 40 to 50 men, sometimes up to 80, but really 40 to 50 men typically on a typical cargo ship, a Liberty ship. Most of those were merchant marines, and maybe a dozen or so were naval men who would help, in the event of a conflict at sea. So they were not known as troop carrying ships. It just was not their purpose. Troops went over on other kind of boats, but not the Liberty ships for the most part.
Who was Jerry Land?
Yeah, Admiral Emery Scott Jerry Land. So he was the head of the Maritime Commission and really was Roosevelt's sort of right-hand man in terms of overseeing this program and getting these ships built. When I mentioned before the British shipbuilder who came over from England, Robert Thompson, his first meeting in Washington was with Admiral Jerry Land. And Land was the one who said, "We will help you find a way to build these ships, but we're not going to build them for you at our shipyards, because our shipyards are too important right now, and you need to go find a different way to get these ships done." So he sort of lent a hand, but he also said, you need to go out and find a way to get these ships built. And he oversaw the production of the Liberty ship program. He was a foul-mouthed sort of guy who had a history in the Navy and had a penchant for cursing and blunt sort of talk. And he really had no problem speaking out to the president. He was one of the few men who could speak out to the president, and the president would take it. They had a lot of sort of funny and hard exchanges over the course of the war, but Land really had the respect of the president and was instrumental in sort of overseeing this program.
How many people did it take to build a ship?
So the Liberty ships, a couple of things that were really interesting about the innovation of the Liberty ships. So the first Liberty ships that were built took, between 7 and 9 months to build, the very first ones. And that's from starting to outfitting them to putting them out on the ocean. Everybody knew that was too long. That was, they needed to speed that up. And one of the things that Henry Kaiser did that was interesting is he was trying to figure out how do we build these ships faster. They needed to be built faster and faster. And how do we get, as many men working on them as possible? He recognized that, there's another Henry Kaiser recognized there was another Henry at the time who was doing some pretty innovative things up in Detroit, and that was Henry Ford. And he wondered, how is Henry Ford able to pump out 40,000 vehicles a month out of his automobile manufacturing plants? And so he sent an employee up to Detroit to sort of look at what Ford was doing. And what he recognized and what he learned from that was Ford, of course, had perfected the assembly line manufacturing process, the mass manufacturing assembly line. Vehicles would roll down an assembly line. One component or one part of the vehicle would be built, and then it would move down to another group of people. They would work on it, and then to another group of people, and they would work on it. And so more people could work on the vehicle at once rather than just, a stationary thing where it could only have so many people working on it. That was sort of a revolutionary idea, of course, and it struck a note for Henry Kaiser. Rolling a 15-foot automobile down an assembly line is one thing. You couldn't roll a 441-foot Liberty ship down an assembly line. That was obviously not feasible. But what you could do, and I'll try to use a metaphor here or an analogy to make this easy to understand. Many of us have opened up a box of Legos, or maybe you've given a gift to a child or a grandchild, a box of Legos. And you open up that box of Legos, and inside of it are individual bags of pieces of that thing that you're going to build. Each of those bags contains a part of the thing you're going to build. So imagine now if instead of one person dumping all those pieces into one pile, you handed one of those bags to a group of friends, and then another bag to another group of friends, and a third bag to another group of friends. And they each built their own component of that device separately. And then when they were done, they brought those big pieces together and snapped them together into one giant completed project. That is a little bit like how the Liberty ship came to be built under Henry Kaiser. He created these sort of giant warehouses on his shipyards where individual components could be built separately rather than everything being built on the shipway itself. And so the deck house, as one example, was essentially a 3-story building. That was built completely away from where the ship was being built by a separate team of workers, hundreds of workers just working on the deck house. And when they finished it, they would bring it out in like 3 or 4 parts and then just lift it up with cranes and hoist it onto the top of the ship and plop it on and attach it, and it was done. That sort of innovation in building some of these Liberty ships sped up the process dramatically. So now instead of maybe 100 workers or a few hundred workers working just on the shipway itself, you could have thousands of workers working at the same time on different components around the shipyard. And that really sped up the construction process of these Liberty ships from 7 months to 5 months to 3 months to, less than a month.
So one of the big differences between the British and the United States experts in all this is the British wanted rivets and the United States wanted welding. Explain that.
So ships, a lot of things up until that time, like ships, were being riveted together. And we've all heard the term Rosie the Riveter. That's certainly how many of the airplanes and other things were being built at the time. They were being riveted together. Riveting, I'll use my fingers to try to make this metaphor, make this analogy. When you rivet two things together, it looks like that. You have to drill something or rivet something to connect the two pieces. So there's overlapping of the two parts like that. But when you weld something, it's more like that. So now you're just sort of connecting the two pieces together, but you're not necessarily riveting something like that. So welding was seen as a faster, more efficient, and also it's saved in this use of steel because you don't have that overlapping steel now. It's a difference. So that was a valuable sort of change in how the ships were built. There was concern or questions about whether the welding would be as strong a hold as the riveting. Would it hold on the open ocean waters that were choppy? And when a ship was holding as much cargo as it was, would the welding hold? But the welding was seen as faster and better and more efficient than the riveting. And so the ships were, for the most part, all welded together, not riveted. And that's why there was another term that was born. Again, we hear the term Rosie the Riveter. Many of the workers, the female workers who worked on these ships, became known as Wendy the Welder. And that was a term that became popularized back during the Liberty ship construction because what it was discovered is that women were actually better at welding than men in many ways. Women could reach into these tight crevices and tight corners with the welding tools that were necessary better and more efficiently than the men could. And so that was really important, and it played a critical role in why the women were really so vital in the building of the Liberty ships. And they had welding contests around the country to see who could be the fastest welder. And some women were invited to go meet Eleanor Roosevelt at the White House for winning these competitions. And so the women welders, Wendy the Welder, played a really instrumental role in in the Liberty ships.
This number from your book, 750 welding schools and 50,000 welders trained per month?
Yeah, so you have to remember, right? Like we're building these Liberty ships, but we were not a trained country in shipbuilding. We had people who, certainly knew how to build ships, but we needed a whole new workforce now of shipbuilders. In order to do that, you needed to train them how to build, how to do the welding, or how to do the plumbing, or how to, melt the steel, and all these different things that people had to be trained in how to do. So shipyard schools and training programs were set up around the country to do that. It was another thing that they learned when they visited Detroit and Henry Ford. They talked to the workers about how they were trained. And they really were struck by how short the training was. They essentially got a couple of days of training, and then they were essentially thrust into the field with managers overseeing them. And that was sort of revolutionary for Henry Kaiser's workers. I think he recognized that our training programs were too long. We don't have the luxury of training people for 3 months. We can't do that. We need to get them out into the shipyards. So they cut down the time that people were trained, and they put them into the shipyards quicker. And they were overseen by managers and other people who knew what they were doing.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute.
How many shipyards were there?
So originally there were 9 shipyards that built Liberty ships around the country. More eventually got involved, but originally there were 9 from Pacific Coast, so Richmond, California, and Seattle, and Tacoma, and Vancouver, then down to Houston and Los Angeles, and then on the East Coast, I mentioned Portland and North Carolina. Mobile, Alabama was one. So there were 9 originally, and then there were some that were added.
What was your favorite story about one of the ships being built?
So I think one of the things that I have, if there's one memory I'm going to take away from my research, this is it. When you're researching World War II today, so I'm researching workers who worked on these ships. That was really important to me. But if you do the math, it's not in your favor, because if you look at the math, let's say someone who worked on a Liberty ship in 1940, just to use a round number, and let's say they were 20 years old in 1940. That meant that they were born in 1920. That meant that when I started my research in 2020, if I was hoping to find someone who worked on a Liberty ship alive, they would be 100 years old. And so when I was researching the book, I was sort of secretly hopeful that I might find someone who worked on a Liberty ship. And I spent a lot of time trying to hunt down people who worked on these ships. And it was really hard. I would often find articles of people who were alive in like 2018 or 2015. But then when I would do a little more researching, I would unfortunately, find their obituary because they'd passed away. Obviously, people were old. If you were working on a Liberty ship in 1940, 1941, 1942, you were going to be 100 years old. In 2023, I stumbled onto an article in Maine of a husband and wife who were celebrating their birthday. And the article in Maine said that both of them, the husband and wife, had both worked in the Portland, Maine shipyard building Liberty ships. I was struck by that and thought it was interesting. And I sent an email to the daughter of them. I was able to track down the email of the daughter of the guy who was being celebrated. And she responded the next day. And she wrote me and said that my mother had passed away 6 months ago, but my father is still here, sharp as a tack, 102 years old, and he would be happy to talk to you. He would love to talk to you. And I remember thinking to myself, can I come up tonight? Wanted to get up there very quickly. We emailed for a couple of weeks, and I was able to go up to Portland and meet her, and she took me to her house. And I met Arthur Babineau. He was 102 years old. He was, as she said, sharp as a tack. We sat down at his kitchen table, and for 3 hours, I just sat and listened to him tell me stories about his experience working on the Liberty ships in the Portland, Maine shipyard. He told me stories about inspecting the welds on the ships, which was his job, riding a bus to work every day. He told me the story about hearing about Pearl Harbor when he was on the bus and learning about Pearl Harbor for the first time, the attack there. And it was a really sort of moving sort of experience for me to talk to this guy who was 102 years old, who helped build Liberty ships. And I felt very fortunate that I was able to do that because they're hard to find now. There may not be many left. He died 6 months later, but I was able to include a few pages of him in my book, and I was really grateful and glad that I was able to have that experience. And I know Donna was really appreciative that her father's legacy sort of lives on in the book. And that was sort of important to me. So that was a story that I just enjoyed telling.
What was the fastest ship ever built?
Yeah, so the book sort of gets into the speed that these ships were built. There was a race and a competition that I really get into in the book. to see who could build the fastest ship. And again, I think I'll go back to the contrast. Remember that the first ships took 7 to 9 months to build. And then in late 1942, workers at Henry Kaiser's shipyard in Richmond, California, sort of combined all of their innovations, all of their ideas, all of their suggestions to build the fastest ship, to piece it together all at once. And it was really an idea to just inspire the nation a little bit and to get people excited about Liberty ships. Getting a nation excited about a 440-foot steel cargo ship wasn't very easy. And this was definitely a marketing gimmick by Henry Kaiser. There's no question. And some people criticize Kaiser for being too invested in marketing himself and promoting himself. And there's some truth to that for sure. But the Robert E. Peary, the SS Robert E. Peary, was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Around the clock, workers worked on it 24/7 for almost 5 days straight. And it was just this remarkable sort of feat and achievement that was, in fact, a motivating factor for the nation. Kaiser successfully was able to sort of turn that sort of event into a thing that newspapers around the country covered. And there were headlines all across the country saying, a Kaiser ship launches in 4 days. And people were reading about this like, it's crazy. And so it was a remarkable sort of achievement.
At any one given time during that 4 days, how many thousands of people were working on the construction?
Yeah, more than 2,000, between 2,000 and 3,000 men sort of worked on that ship in various shifts. They were taking 8-hour shifts. They would go on, go off. They would never leave the shipyard. So they would work their shift, go sleep a couple hours, then go do another shift. So they just sort of never left the shipyard for that time. And that was sort of what allowed them to sort of just have this rotating crew of workers just constantly, working on it. And it never sort of rested until it was put to sea.
You point out that during this period, about 500,000 African Americans moved to California.
Right.
And moved west. But then you also point out that the unions prevented the black workers from joining.
Yeah, I mean, the shipyards became sort of a melting pot, in a lot of ways, of workers. And it was not without friction. Some of the unions were very restrictive, didn't want women involved, it didn't want blacks involved. And they sort of were very, old school, run by white men who'd been doing it the same way for all the years that they'd been involved in these unions. And so involving blacks in the unions, involving women in the unions was a challenge. But again, the shipyard managers really enforced and pushed this to happen because they knew that we didn't have the time or the patience to sort of let these unions be obstacles in getting the work done. And so that was something that happened over time, but really was important for the workers and for these shipyards to be able to welcome women, blacks, and sort of just a diverse workforce.
You sent me on a wild goose chase when you started talking about the naming of these ships because I found a Wikipedia site that has all the names.
Yeah.
And some of the names, John Ringling Brothers Circus, Alexander H. Stevens, the former vice president of the Confederacy, got a name on one of his ships. And Mark Hanna, of all things, the McKinley political advisor in Ohio. How did they name these ships?
Yeah, there was a woman who was put in charge of that sort of effort. She was appointed to sort of be in charge of the naming effort. Names were solicited from around the country. School children were submitting names, and families were coming up having contests to come up with names. And so it was a real effort to make sure that the Liberty ships covered a diverse range of people: women, men, poets and artists and politicians. The only qualification was you had to be dead. That was the only requirement. There was one story, a brief anecdote I tell in the book about a California politician who heard that a Liberty ship was being named in his honor and he was not dead. And he wanted to make sure that they knew that. And then he was informed that, it's actually not you. There was another person of your name. It's named after them, not you. And he didn't know that. So there were just, the names really did come from all over. They had to name, 2,700 ships. That's a lot of names, but it was not a problem. They were able to successfully come up with some obscure names, some weird names, but a diverse collection of names for these ships.
Frankly, the strangest thing on the list that I found was the name that Sam would be the first part of the name. And then there was, I just wrote 5 of them down: Sam Crest, Sam But, Sam Burke, Sam Glory, Sam Hope. Did you ever look into that?
I didn't look into that one, but the other one I did look into, which was funny, is there were Williams. So there was Will Williams and Willie Williams and Bill Williams, and there were all these different sort of names that were very, very similar. So first name, last name, there were some funny quirks in the naming process. And another change that happened over time, at first, the idea was they only could be American. That was another change. But then over time, they recognized that, no, we can have some international names as well. So that happened as well.
Joseph Pulitzer.
Right.
George McClellan, the man that ran against Lincoln in 1964.
Right.
Matthew Brady, the Mayo brothers.
Yes. So there were some really interesting, collections of names, but the names, and even heroes, one ship was named after a captain of a different Liberty ship who died. So it was a diverse collection. But yeah.
Let me ask you, we'll do a little more on the Liberty ships, but about yourself.
Yeah.
Where are you from originally?
I am originally, I guess you could say I'm a New Englander. So I was born in Boston, grew up in Rhode Island. My career has been as a journalist and a storyteller. So I was working in newspapers up and down the East Coast, South Carolina, New Jersey, New York City. And then I came to Boston. Worked at different newspapers and magazines. Always sort of interested in narrative storytelling. I think is safe to say that I've always enjoyed that aspect of journalism and writing. So this is my third book. Books have been spaced out over time within my career. My first book was a true crime book from a case I covered back in New Jersey. A sensational sort of murder case that got national coverage that I wrote about. And then I wrote a book about 10 years ago about the birth of the subway in America. Boston has the first subway, and that was a subject I was really interested in. And so it was about the history of the subway and how that got built. Boston and New York sort of building the first 2 subways in America. And then this book. So these have been sort of like side projects for me that I really have enjoyed, and a way to sort of get into narrative storytelling. I've always just loved the research part of history and enjoying getting into some of these things. And so, yeah, that's sort of been my career. It's been a journey for sure.
What's your full-time job now?
Now I worked for about 15 years at the Boston Globe as an editor. And then I left the Globe right before the COVID pandemic happened. And I joined Boston University to oversee the newsroom and the editorial marketing department of Boston University. So I run a newsroom there where we essentially cover Boston University as our beat. It's a big university, a really important institution in the city of Boston. And it's been a great sort of experience of writing about research and students and faculty and covering BU. It's a great institution. It's been sort of it was a pivot for me to move out of a newsroom for the first time, but it's something I've really sort of enjoyed. It's been a nice change of pace for me.
Go back to the rivets versus welding. And the question I have about that is, because the American ships were welded mostly, did any of them break up at sea?
So I talk about this at the very end of the book. Yeah. So essentially what happened is some of the ships started to develop some cracks. Usually the cracks were not catastrophic. They were fixable and they were repaired and put back out on the sea. It was usually attributed to either a welding problem or sometimes a steel problem. Sometimes the steel was not always consistent. And so sometimes it was substandard steel that was used. So it was different factors might have contributed to some of these cracks that developed. Toward the end of the war, eventually what happened was a couple of ships developed really bad cracks. And after inspection and investigation, they decided to modify the Liberty ship design slightly and create a different type of ship. and they created something that was called the Victory ship, which replaced the Liberty ship. And that was the last ship that was sort of the last cargo ship that was built for the war, were the Victory ships. And there were about 400 of those built in addition to the 2,700 Liberty ships that were slightly modified. I would call them sort of step siblings of the Liberty ships. If you put them next to each other, they were probably like fraternal twins. They looked a lot alike, but not identical.
When did the Maritime Commission and the United States stop using Liberty ships altogether?
That's a good question. So they were used in the 1950s for various purposes. A lot of them were eventually in the 50s and 60s. They were scrapped for their metal, so the metal could be reused, and that was a big sort of factor in them sort of not having a life beyond the war. A couple ships were used for weird, sort of funny purposes. I mentioned the John W. Brown ship was actually used as a New York City schoolroom or classroom, public school for about 20 years in New York City, was modified into a class, a school. So they were used for different reasons. They were sort of just eventually replaced by more modernized ships and sort of put out to pasture, if you want to think of it that way. And that's how they were sort of eventually scrapped for steel. That was, I think, again, back to that debate about how to build them. They were not ever seen as ships that were going to serve a real purpose for us for 20 or 30 years. They were just never built that way.
When, from your research, did the U-boats lose the whole battle?
Yeah, I don't know if it's that the U-boats lost the battle so much as it is America won the battle. I think that America just overwhelmed sort of the oceans with so many ships and so many vessels. Not just Liberty ships, but everything that we did and produced. Roosevelt, we talk about the term arsenal of democracy, and Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy really was the key to the victory, just producing so much of a wartime economy that we just eventually overwhelmed the German effort. So I think that the U-boats were always effective when they were out there, but there were not enough of them to sort of defeat the massive arsenal that America produced.
What was the story about the Liberty boats, ships over in the Pacific and the Japanese?
So the Liberty ships, one of the reasons they were built on both coasts was because we were fighting a war in both oceans. We were fighting a war in the Pacific and the Atlantic, and it was vital for us to be able to send cargo ships both directions. And so they were used, in Asia. They were landing in Asia, and they were also landing in Europe, and they were vital in both places. The story I told the story of the Peary ship. That ship was sent over to Asia and went in that direction and was used to make a lot of runs over in that direction. So the Liberty ships were not just used in the European front, they were used in both directions because they were built on both coasts. That was strategic by the United States to make sure they were able to go both directions. If they'd only built them on the East Coast, that would have been a real problem for the United States because we were fighting across two oceans, not one.
What did it cost per ship?
So the dollar amount that was attached to a ship was $160,000. That was the dollar amount that was attached to a ship. And translating that to real dollars today obviously is difficult. You can attach inflation to it. I never feel like that number really works out entirely. But each ship was the dollar figure attached to a ship. And the total effort was in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But the initial investment for the Liberty Ship program Roosevelt put in was $330 million, was the initial investment that Roosevelt put into the Liberty Ship program. That was how much he first invested in it.
What was FDR's reaction to this whole project?
Something I think he was very proud of. I think, again, going back to that decision he made, he sort of got a kick out of the fact that the ships were nicknamed the Ugly Ducklings and were sort of not these pretty ships. But I think he really did appreciate the ability when one ship was sunk or was taken out of commission, he knew that another ship was right behind it, or 10 ships were right behind it. And so he appreciated the fact that these ships were being built so fast and pumping out so quickly that, eventually we were able to pump out, 80, 100, 120 Liberty ships in a single month. And that was sort of a remarkable pace in 1942 and 1943 to crank these ships out that quickly. Again, we talked about before, to sort of overwhelm the seas with so many ships.
Does Doug Most have a book he's working on for the next reader?
Yeah, not yet. He's thinking about it. He's looking for another idea. He's got ideas, but this book is fresh out there. It just came out in late summer, early fall. And so I'm excited to talk about it and get out there and do events. And I love doing events like this. And so I'm really just sort of talking about this book and getting people to think about it as a holiday gift, and drive people to really learn a story about World War II that I think was maybe not as appreciated and understood as well as I hope my story brings it to life.
The name of the book again is Launching Liberty, subtitled To Build the Ships That Took America to War, The Epic Race. Our guest has been Doug Most in Boston. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Enjoyed the conversation, and enjoy your fall. We appreciate the time.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.